Tonight on Brian Ross Investigates, a summer of reckoning for a billionaire with powerful friends who thought he got away with it.
Epstein is alleged to have abused dozens of victims by causing them to engage in sex acts with him at his mansion in New York and at his estate in Palm Beach, Florida.
Or the leader of a church that claims 5 million members, alleged to have abused his teenage followers.
The type of crimes that belong nowhere in our society.
For a beloved and trusted swimming coach.
I mean, there was some touching of the breasts and things like that.
Will there finally be justice for dozens, hundreds of vulnerable victims?
We were underage. We were little girls.
How could this go on for so long before anyone tried to stop it?
Too often, adults in our society have turned a blind eye to this type of criminal behavior alleged here.
Plus, our shout-out for the Miami Herald reporter, whose stories helped make sure the voices of his young victims were finally heard.
Someone's finally understanding that we weren't prostitutes, we were girls.
From the Law&Crime Network studios in New York City's Herald Square, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening and welcome. Tonight, the summer of reckoning for some very powerful men accused of the repugnant sexual abuse of underage victims. Religious leaders, trusted coaches and doctors, and now this week, a multi-millionaire by the name of Jeffrey Epstein, arrested on sex trafficking charges by the FBI as he stepped off his private jet outside New York. He pleaded not guilty and will be back in court next week, with his lawyers arguing today he should be released on bail. Prosecutors said there were dozens of victims, and they issued a plea for more victims to come forward.
Victims' voices, including the many voices of Epstein's alleged victims, must be heard. If you believe you are a victim of this man, Jeffrey Epstein, or you have evidence or information relating to the conduct alleged in the indictment unsealed today, we want to hear from you. Please call 1-800-CALL-FBI. That's 1-800-CALL-FBI.
In addition to the young women who say Epstein abused them at his mansion in New York City, FBI agents say they uncovered additional evidence when they raided the place and broke into his safe, finding what they called devastating evidence of guilt.
Contemporaneous with the arrest of Epstein at Teterboro Airport, agents executed a search warrant on his mansion in New York City and recovered and seized, and that was a search pursuant to a valid warrant. Agents seized evidence, including nude photographs of what appeared to be underage girls.
Prosecutors said there were hundreds, if not thousands, of such photos. All the more amazing because Epstein has supposedly put all this behind him when he got a sweetheart deal from federal prosecutors in Miami, pleading guilty to a minor state charge that required him to serve only about a year behind bars in a county jail that actually allowed him to go to his office every day. Yet he kept those photos carefully labeled and hidden in his safe. Hardly the actions of a man who had learned the errors of his way from his earlier brush with the law, apparently counting on his powerful and well-connected friends to overlook what he had done.
Too often, adults in our society have turned a blind eye to this type of criminal behavior alleged here. We have seen the excuses, the ignorance of many who didn't even bother to understand that this behavior is a persistent scourge against our society's vulnerable youth, and the willful blindness as to who the real villains are in this type of outrageous crime. The villains are the adult perpetrators, not the children.
As for Epstein's powerful friends, they were running for cover in the wake of his arrest. President Trump now says he never had a friendship with Epstein.
Well, I knew him like everybody in Palm Beach knew him. I mean, people in Palm Beach knew him. He was a fixture in Palm Beach. I had a falling out with him a long time ago. I don't think I've spoken to him for 15 years. I wasn't a fan. I was not, a long time ago. I'd say maybe 15 years. I was not a fan of his.
But earlier, Trump had told New York Magazine, "I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with." And added, "It's even said he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. No doubt about it, Jeffrey enjoys his social life." President Clinton, who traveled frequently on Epstein's private jet, had his office issue its own statement that Clinton knows nothing about the allegations and that any travel with Epstein was connected to the work of the Clinton Foundation. As for Prince Andrew of England, seen here in this photo with a then 16-year-old girl who claims in court papers she was one of Epstein's sex slaves, there has been no comment from the palace. The prince had earlier denied he had sex with the young woman. Joining us now to talk about Epstein and the other prominent men facing similar charges is Janet Rosen, the executive director of the American Professional Society of the Abuse of Children, author of The Sex-Wise Parents, a guide for parents talking with their children about sexual predators and abuse. Ms. Rosen, thank you for joining us. What do you make of all these prominent men now facing this reckoning?
It's about time that we recognize the impact this kind of behavior has on kids. It's about time that we recognize that all kids are valuable, that there's no such thing as a throwaway kid. And I think what's happening now, kind of in the wake of the Me Too movement, is finally we're being able to talk openly and honestly about sex, about sexuality, in ways that blow the cover from these guys. Because in our culture, when we don't talk about sex, when parents can't talk to their kids or don't talk to kids about their sex, we're given the bad guys cover. And it's about time that cover is gone.
Dr. Rosenzweig, these sexual predators are known to groom their victims. How do they look for a victim? What are they looking for?
Well, if they're smart, they're looking for kids that are going to be vulnerable. But there's all kinds of vulnerability. One of the most common kinds of vulnerability, particularly with young girls, is when they don't understand their own sexuality. When kids are raised without any kind of understanding about human sexual response, about what their bodies do as an autonomic, natural response to a feeling or a stimuli, kids, particularly girls, can be at risk of mistaking sexual arousal for love or something more important than that. And men can exploit that. They can exploit that ignorance. They can exploit that vulnerability. And then we find these kids thinking that it was love, it was real, it was something more important, finding out it was nothing more than a financial transaction, which leaves them devastated. Then we've got to deal with folks, with trauma going into their adult lives.
Dr. Rosenzweig, a question for you from our control room from executive producer Rhonda Schwartz.
So what can parents or adults do to protect their children?
Oh, that's a great question. Probably one of the most important things parents need to be doing is starting from as young as possible, when it's age appropriate, to make sure they talk about sex and sexuality and bodies and relationships as part of everyday life. One of the things we find, along with the lack of information about sexuality, is, the offenders somehow manage to become grown human beings who have no or little regard for the feelings of other human beings. So as well as parents working to raise kids that understand sexuality in their bodies, that's one way we can, that's a great protective factor against victimization, but it's a really important protective factor against raising a perpetrator is to teach kids empathy, to teach kids to understand the impact of their behaviors on other people. I mean, the very same concepts that we talk about with bullying prevention, we look at these guys that we're talking about in the show tonight, and we've got bullying taken to an absolutely horrendous extreme.
Dr. Rosenzweig, one of the amazing things about the charges against Epstein were the extent to which his aides helped him recruit other young women, and the young women themselves helped to recruit.
I know. It's a concept we talk about, social norms. People learn to accept things as normal, as accepted, without questioning it. And broadcasts like this one, or shows like this one, and efforts like this one, we have to change the social norms to make it clear that there's no such thing as underage women. They're children. There's no such thing as a child prostitute. It's a victim. We've got to change the social norm, and the Me Too movement is starting that, so that nobody accepts this. Nobody accepts that it's par for the course to solicit kids for their boss because that makes them happy. We really have to change that.
Right. Dr. Rosen, stay with us now, because when we come back after our break, we're going to talk about another prominent person who also is facing similar charges. The leader of a church claiming to have 5 million members, also under arrest on charges he abused underage girls, telling them they were doing right by God. We're back now with our special report on what has become a summer of reckoning for some powerful men accused of the sexual abuse of underage victims. In sports, we've reported here on the ongoing scandal at USA Swimming. Hundreds of coaches banned because of alleged sexual abuse of young swimmers, with new cases still coming in. The outrage continues over similar allegations involving USA Gymnastics and the team doctor, Dr. Larry Nassar, who used his position of power to molest and abuse dozens of youngsters. And in the world of religion, the stories of abuse seem to never end, most recently involving the leader of a church which claims to have 5 million members, active, it says, in all 50 states, plus 58 countries around the world.
Mientras algunos digan que Dios no existe, Señor.
Nassan Joaquin Garcia began his career as a minister in Arizona and Southern California before taking over as the leader of a church that calls itself the Light of the World, claiming members in 58 countries. He teaches that he is the apostle of Jesus Christ. And 1 week before he was arrested on sex trafficking and abuse charges, he warned his devoted followers that those who would oppose him were like a cancer.
Trata de contaminar con su cáncer, que es la maldad, que es la impiedad.
1 week later, the apostle of Jesus was under arrest in Los Angeles, the California Attorney General calling him sick and demented.
The type of crimes that belong nowhere in our society, from human trafficking, production of child pornography.
The Attorney General said the beloved church leader was provided by his followers with images of teenage girls who were told to, quote, take off their clothing, touch each other's breasts and vaginas, and lick whipped cream off each other's breasts, unquote.
They were parishioners, if you wish to call them that. This is a pretty large organization. I hesitate to call it a church, a mega church, and it has a lot of followers. And these are, some people would probably call this a case of brainwashing, or where these families are influenced.
With their leader, the apostle of Jesus Christ, behind bars, awaiting trial, members of the church were instructed to pray for Joaquin Garcia.
The false allegations leveled against our church leader, Apostle Nassan Joaquin Garcia, have caused our church a deep sadness. However, our church community is confident the allegations will be proven false.
And we continue our conversation now with Dr. Janet Rosen, author of The Sex-Wise Parents, a guide to help parents protect their children. And Dr. Rosenzweig, thank you for joining us. Let me ask you, these are men of incredible power and influence. There's a sense of trust they have, that they ask their followers to trust them.
Yes, and what followers should be trusting is their own faith and their own spirituality, but they should be trusting their own instincts about what's right and what's wrong. And the values that they grew up with, the values that they learned, somewhere deep inside, the parents of these kids or the kids themselves have a sense that this isn't right, that this isn't what's supposed to happen. And these folks in power, these folks in authority, get so good at manipulating them to get rid of their own judgment. That's why I think it's so critical, and I'm consistently urging parents to keep the communication open with their kids. There is no mainstream Western religion that does not recognize the right and responsibility for parents to talk to their kids about sex and sexuality. And when they're part of the fundamentalist movement or a religious organization that tries to silence them on that topic, what that silence does, once again, is it gives the bad guys cover.
And Doctor, how do these leaders achieve that silence? How do they persuade their young victims to stay quiet?
Well, one of the things they do is they convince them that what they're doing is special, that what they're doing is private. They convince them that this relationship is going to make them very special and make them private. Then if it gets to the point, what some abusers do, they manage to elicit a sexual response from a child. An orgasm or even almost orgasm, and then they convince the child they were complicit. And when a child is trapped like that, particularly this happens to boys, when a child is trapped like that into believing not only something bad happened to them, but what's wrong with me because I liked it, that sets the stage for later mental health issues when something that they know is wrong actually ends up feeling good, and molesters, abusers take advantage of that. And if kids understand that this is just what bodies do, that arousal and response is as autonomic as getting goosebumps when they're cold, boy, is that a protective factor against that kind of lying and manipulation.
Doctor, do you blame the parents at all of the young victims?
No, I don't blame parents, particularly this generation's parents, because this generation of parents came of age in the 80s and 90s when they probably got very little sex information in school. The folks that are parenting kids now grew up in the abstinence-only age where, parents that went to school in the 60s and 70s had a much stronger background in human sexuality and sexual health than the parents that went to school in the 80s and 90s. And one of the ways we can do this, and that's organized religion and organized youth serving agencies, some of them are doing fabulous jobs reaching out to parents and families to help them promote sexual health and safety. And if there's any silver lining to this awful, awful summer of reckoning, as you're calling it, it's how many organizations are stepping forward and recognizing what they can do to help keep kids and families safe.
And quickly, we just have 30 seconds. Do you think there'll be more victims coming forward now with all the coverage of these events?
I can only hope that more victims come forward, because we know from retrospective studies what a huge number of victims there are out there. And as organizations, incidents like this one, help let kids know it was not their fault, help let kids know they were manipulated by people with more power, I hope more victims come forward and people are there to catch them.
Dr. Janet Rosen, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your insights. Coming up, our shout out for the Miami Herald reporter who helped to expose the kid gloves treatment of accused trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. It was her work that gave a voice to his many victims. And our shout out tonight is for Julie Brown, the Miami Herald reporter whose investigation into the Jeffrey Epstein case helped to spark the outrage over the handling of this affair by federal authorities, including Alexander Acosta, who resigned just today as the Secretary of Labor because of his handling of the Epstein prosecution. We first highlighted Brown's work on our very first edition of Brian Ross Investigates, well before all the recent developments, and it's worth taking a look again. Today, a shout out to the Miami Herald for its explosive investigation into how this billionaire, convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, was able to get what was essentially a slap on the wrist for abusing dozens of underage girls.
We didn't really know how many there were. Part of this story is how much was kept secret in the court documents.
Reporter Julie Brown spent more than a year tracking down the young women who were Epstein's victims.
I probably spoke with about 8, and of those 8, only 4 wanted to go on were courageous enough to go on the record.
In a powerful video Brown produced with her partner, Emily Michaud.
We were underage. We were little girls.
I was 16.
I was 16.
I started going to him when I was like 14 turning 15.
If you think at 14, $200, that's a lot of money at 14 years old. That's a lot of money now.
And then Brown spent countless hours doing journalism the old-fashioned, tried and true way, to learn about the lenient deal federal prosecutors cut with Epstein, requiring him to serve only 13 months in a county jail.
These are 10 to 12 years worth of documents. There was probably thousands, if not tens of thousands of documents to wade through.
But the turning point came, Brown says, when 2 key police officials trusted her enough to lay out what really happened behind the scenes.
It started out, give a man a back rub, but many cases it turned into something far worse than that, elevated to a crime, and a serious crime.
What he ended up pleading to was a joke. The sentence he served was even a bigger joke, and then his probation was a slap in everybody's face.
I think once the police chief was willing to go on the record with me and the lead detective, both of them had never given interviews before, and I think after we did their interviews, we really realized how good of a story we had, and it went to the heart of how much influence Epstein had, and how he and the people that work for him bullied everyone associated with this case.
And look, who knows what else is going to come out? I mean, the excellent journalism has spread the message. It's not just a state court case that's stuck in Palm Beach County now. People are really aware of what's going on.
Brown's reporting raised questions about the federal prosecutor at the time, Alex Acosta, who is now the Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration. He seemed to go to great lengths to cut a lenient deal with Epstein and keep the whole process secret, according to Brown. Acosta defended the deal during his Senate confirmation hearings.
That Mr. Epstein should plead guilty to 2 years, register as a sex offender, and concede liability so the victims could get restitution. And if that were done, the federal interest would be satisfied and we would defer to the state.
Brown got no comment from Epstein, nor did we. But one of his lawyers, Alan Dershowitz, told me he was proud of the deal he made for his client.
So no regrets then in arranging a deal in which he spent only 13 months behind bars?
I wish I could have gotten him a deal where he spent only 10 months. I mean, the job of a criminal defense lawyer is to get the best possible deal. If I had been able to get him a deal where he spent no time in prison, that would have been even better.
Members of Congress have now asked for a full investigation of the deal in the wake of Julie Brown's reporting, and she is continuing on the story, knowing that her efforts made a difference and gave Epstein's young victims a sense of justice that the Department of Justice did not.
They were made to believe that they were prostitutes. So they finally said, someone's finally understanding that we weren't prostitutes, we were girls. He violated us. Maybe now something will change. I think they're still hoping for a sense of justice, that something will be done in the case.
Since we first gave Julie Brown a shout out, the Epstein case has become a major story, including the new charges against him, which could put Epstein in prison for the rest of his life if found guilty, as well as today's resignation by Labor Secretary Acosta over his handling of the case, which came despite his claims he had acted entirely appropriately. The power of investigative reporting, the story of the year. Epstein will be back in court next week, and we'll continue our coverage here on the Law and Crime Network. That's our program for tonight. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back here next week.